In the winter of 1845, a traveling preacher arrived in the small town of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, carrying with him a message that would forever change the lives of every soul who heard it. Elder Thomas Blackwood stood before the weathered congregation of St. Catherine's Church, his piercing blue eyes scanning the faces of farmers, shopkeepers, and widows who had gathered seeking comfort in the harsh Pennsylvania winter. What they found instead was something far more sinister than they could have ever imagined. The good people of Millbrook had no way of knowing that the charismatic preacher before them was orchestrating what would become one of the most elaborate and horrifying religious conspiracies in American history. Over the next 11 years, 113 members of his congregation would disappear without a trace, their families told they had been called to missionary work in distant lands. The truth, however, was far more disturbing. These devoted followers weren't serving God in foreign missions. They were buried in unmarked graves beneath the very church where they had once prayed for salvation. The year was 1845, and Pennsylvania was experiencing what historians would later call the Second Great Awakening. Religious fervor swept through communities like wildfire, and traveling preachers could draw crowds numbering in the hundreds. It was into this atmosphere of spiritual hunger that Elder Thomas Blackwood arrived in Millbrook, a town of barely 800 souls nestled in the rolling hills of central Pennsylvania. Blackwood was a man of commanding presence. At 42, he stood nearly 6 feet tall, with steel gray hair and those penetrating blue eyes that seemed to look directly into one's soul. His voice carried the authority of someone who had spent decades studying scripture, and his sermons were unlike anything the simple farming community had ever heard. Where other preachers spoke of God's love and forgiveness, Blackwood preached about purification through sacrifice and the necessity of proving one's devotion through absolute surrender. The congregation of St. Catherine's Church had been without a permanent pastor for nearly 8 months when Blackwood arrived. Their previous minister, Reverend Samuel Morrison, had died suddenly of what the local doctor called brain fever, leaving his flock spiritually adrift during one of the harshest winters in recent memory. The timing of Blackwood's arrival seemed providential, and the church elders welcomed him with open arms, grateful for his willingness to tend to their spiritual needs. What the good people of Millbrook didn't know was that Blackwood had been carefully planning his arrival for months. He had spent the previous year traveling through Pennsylvania, studying small communities and identifying those most vulnerable to his particular brand of religious manipulation. Millbrook checked every box on his list: isolated location, recent loss of spiritual leadership, struggling economy, and a population desperate for hope and direction. Blackwood's first sermon at St. Catherine's was delivered on a bitter Sunday morning in February 1845. Nearly the entire town crowded into the small wooden church, eager to hear what this distinguished stranger had to say. But Blackwood's interpretation of this familiar passage was unlike anything they had heard before. He spoke of the storehouse not as a metaphor for giving money to the church, but as a physical place where the faithful would literally store their worldly possessions in preparation for the coming judgment. He described visions he claimed to have received, showing him a great purification that would sweep across America, separating the truly faithful from the lukewarm believers. Martha Henderson, a widow who had lost her husband to consumption the previous year, would later recall the electric atmosphere in the church that morning. Elder Blackwood spoke with such authority, she told investigators years later. He didn't just read from the Bible, he seemed to inhabit it. When he described his visions of the coming purification, you could feel the very air in the church change. People were weeping, calling out, falling to their knees. They pledged not just their tithes, but their entire earthly possessions to the storehouse that Blackwood said God had commanded him to establish. More importantly, they pledged absolute obedience to Blackwood's spiritual guidance, believing him to be a prophet sent by God to prepare them for the end times. The transformation of Millbrook began immediately. Within a week of his arrival, Blackwood had established himself in the parsonage behind St. Catherine's Church and had begun construction of what he called the House of Preparation. This large wooden structure, built with donated labor and materials from his growing congregation, would serve as both a communal storehouse and a residence for those who had committed themselves completely to the work. By summer, nearly 60 members of the congregation had moved into the House of Preparation, turning over their farms, businesses, and life savings to Blackwood's control. They lived communally, sharing meals, work responsibilities, and what Blackwood called spiritual exercises designed to purify their souls in preparation for the coming judgment. To outsiders, the arrangement seemed unusual but not alarming. Communal religious groups were not uncommon in 19th century America, and many respected denominations had established similar arrangements. The Shakers, Moravians, and other religious communities had successfully created self-sustaining societies based on shared faith and common property. What made Blackwood's community different was the absolute control he exercised over every aspect of his followers' lives. Members of the House of Preparation were required to obtain Blackwood's permission for everything from personal correspondence to visits with family members outside the community. He established a complex system of spiritual ranks, with himself at the apex as the prophet of preparation, followed by a council of elders who had proven their devotion through special acts of sacrifice. Below them were the prepared, those who had surrendered their worldly possessions, and finally the seekers, newcomers who were still being evaluated for their worthiness. The spiritual exercises that Blackwood prescribed became increasingly extreme as time passed. What began as extended prayer sessions and fasting evolved into elaborate rituals that he claimed were necessary for achieving true purification. Members were required to confess their sins publicly, often in excruciating detail, and to accept whatever penance Blackwood deemed appropriate. These penances ranged from days of solitary confinement to physical labor performed while reciting scripture, but it was the ritual of spiritual calling that would prove most sinister. Beginning in the summer of 1846, Blackwood began announcing that certain members of the community had been called by God to serve as missionaries in distant lands. These individuals, he explained, had achieved such a high level of spiritual purity that they were needed to spread the message of preparation to other communities across America and beyond. The first to receive this calling was Benjamin Crawford, a young farmer who had been among Blackwood's earliest converts. Crawford was described by those who knew him as gentle and devout, someone who had embraced the communal lifestyle with genuine enthusiasm. When Blackwood announced that Crawford had been called to establish a mission in the Oregon Territory, the community gathered for an elaborate farewell ceremony. Crawford's departure was marked by what Blackwood called a translation service, during which the young man was blessed by the prophet and given special instructions for his missionary work. The ceremony took place in the basement of the House of Preparation, in a room that Blackwood had designated as the Sacred Chamber. Only the most spiritually advanced members of the community were permitted to witness these translation services, and they were sworn to secrecy about what transpired during the rituals. Margaret Whitman, who had achieved the rank of elder and was present at Crawford's translation, would later provide investigators with a chilling account of what she witnessed. Benjamin was led into the sacred chamber wearing a white robe, she recalled. Elder Blackwood spoke about the great sacrifice that God required of those called to the highest service. What followed was a ritual that combined elements of baptism, communion, and something far more sinister. Crawford was given a cup of what Blackwood called the wine of transformation, a liquid that appeared to contain some form of narcotic. As the young man became increasingly drowsy, Blackwood explained to the assembled witnesses that they were about to observe a miracle of divine transformation. The details of what happened next would remain locked in the memories of those present, most of whom would never speak of it, even years later. His body was placed in what Blackwood called a sacred repository beneath the church, and the community was told that his earthly form was being preserved until the final judgment, when it would be reunited with his purified spirit. The disappearance of Benjamin Crawford marked the beginning of what would become a systematic program of murder disguised as religious calling. Over the next 5 years, Blackwood would announce the spiritual calling of 44 more members of his community, each following the same pattern of farewell ceremony, translation service, and ultimate disappearance. The families of these missing individuals were told that their loved ones were engaged in sacred work in distant locations and could not maintain contact with the outside world. Letters allegedly written by the missionaries were occasionally shared with the community, but these were always in Blackwood's handwriting, explaining that the missionaries had asked him to transcribe their messages due to illness or injury. Meanwhile, Blackwood's control over the community grew ever more absolute. He established what he called the doctrine of perfect submission, teaching that any questioning of his authority was evidence of spiritual corruption. The economic foundation of the community was also evolving in disturbing ways. While the initial communal arrangement had been based on shared labor and resources, Blackwood began requiring members to actively recruit new converts from outside Millbrook. By 1850, the House of Preparation had grown to include nearly 200 members, making it one of the largest religious communities in Pennsylvania. The original residents of Millbrook had largely been absorbed into the community or had relocated to other areas, unable to cope with the dramatic changes in their town. The few who remained outside Blackwood's influence were either too old or too poor to be of interest to him, and they watched helplessly as their community transformed into something unrecognizable. It was during this period that Blackwood began to expand his operations beyond Millbrook. He established what he called mission stations in 3 other Pennsylvania towns, each led by one of his most trusted elders and following the same pattern of communal living and absolute submission to his authority. These satellite communities served both as recruitment centers and as destinations for members who had begun to question the activities at the main compound. The mission stations also provided Blackwood with a ready explanation for the increasing number of disappearances. When members of the Millbrook community began to ask about friends or family members who had vanished, they were told that these individuals had been transferred to one of the mission stations where their particular skills were needed. The distances involved made verification difficult, and the doctrine of perfect submission discouraged members from asking too many questions. By 1851, Blackwood had refined his operation to a terrifying degree of efficiency. The translation services had evolved into elaborate rituals that combined religious ceremony with what can only be described as systematic murder. The sacred chamber beneath the house of preparation had been expanded into a complex of rooms designed for different aspects of the process, from the initial drugging of victims to the disposal of their remains. The most disturbing aspect of Blackwood's operation was the willing participation of his inner circle. The elders who assisted with the translation services genuinely believed they were participating in divine work. Through years of careful indoctrination, Blackwood had convinced them that the deaths they witnessed were not murders, but sacred transformations, that the victims were being elevated to a higher plane of existence where they could serve God more perfectly. This theological framework was crucial to the operation's success. The elders didn't see themselves as accomplices to murder, but as priests participating in the most sacred of rituals. They helped prepare the victims, administered the drugs, and disposed of the bodies with the same reverence they would show for any religious ceremony. In their minds, they were facilitating divine will, not committing heinous crimes. Blackwood told his followers that this sacred burial ground would be revealed to the world at the time of the final judgment, when the purified souls of the translated would return to claim their preserved earthly forms. As 1852 dawned, Blackwood's community had reached its peak of both size and influence. The House of Preparation now housed nearly 300 members, and the mission stations had grown to include communities in Ohio, Virginia, and New York. The economic power of the organization was substantial, with assets including thousands of acres of farmland, several businesses, and cash reserves that would be worth millions in today's currency. But success brought new challenges. The sheer number of disappearances had begun to attract attention from outside authorities, and family members of missing individuals were starting to ask uncomfortable questions. More troubling for Blackwood was the growing unrest within his own community, as some members began to question the increasingly extreme nature of the spiritual exercises and the disturbing pattern of disappearances among the most devout followers. The first crack in Blackwood's carefully constructed facade came from an unexpected source. Sarah Morrison, the 18-year-old daughter of the late Reverend Samuel Morrison, had been living with relatives in Philadelphia since her father's death. When she returned to Millbrook in the spring of 1852 to settle her father's estate, she was shocked by the transformation of her hometown. Sarah had grown up in St. Catherine's Church and knew many of the families who had joined Blackwood's community. When she inquired about old friends and neighbors, she was told repeatedly that they had been called to missionary work in distant locations. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental, and Sarah's suspicions were aroused when she realized that none of these supposed missionaries had ever written to their families or friends outside the community. When she demanded to know where her father was buried, she was told that his remains had been relocated to a more appropriate site, but no one could or would tell her where. Sarah's inquiries were brought to Blackwood's attention by his followers, who had been trained to report any outside interference to their prophet. Rather than simply having her ejected from the community, Blackwood made a fatal error in judgment. He invited Sarah to join the House of Preparation, offering her the opportunity to achieve the same spiritual purification that had supposedly elevated her former neighbors. The invitation was presented as a great honor, but Sarah recognized it for what it was, an attempt to silence her questions permanently. She declined the invitation and left Millbrook immediately, traveling to Harrisburg, where she sought out the office of the Pennsylvania Attorney General. Her story of missing neighbors, relocated graves, and a religious community that seemed to be consuming its own members was initially met with skepticism, but her detailed knowledge of the people and places involved convinced authorities that her concerns warranted investigation. The investigation that followed would take nearly 2 years and involve some of the most skilled investigators in Pennsylvania. What they uncovered would shock the nation and establish Thomas Blackwood as one of the most prolific killers in American history. But the full scope of his crimes would only become clear when investigators finally gained access to the sacred chamber beneath St. Catherine's Church and discovered the carefully organized burial ground that contained the remains of 113 of his followers. The empty coffins that would give this case its name were discovered in a storage building behind the House of Preparation. Each coffin bore the name of someone who had supposedly been sent on missionary work, and each was filled with rocks and soil to approximate the weight of a human body. These coffins had been prepared for the families of the missing individuals, to be used in memorial services that would provide closure and discourage further questions about their loved ones' whereabouts. Blackwood's plan was to eventually hold elaborate funeral services for the missing missionaries, claiming that word had been received of their deaths from various diseases or accidents in their distant locations. The empty coffins would be buried with great ceremony, and the families would be left with the comforting belief that their loved ones had died serving God in foreign lands. The truth about their actual fate would remain hidden beneath the church floor, known only to Blackwood and his inner circle of devoted elders. The investigation into the Church of the Prepared, as it came to be known in newspaper accounts, would reveal not just the murders of 113 individuals, but a complex criminal enterprise that had operated for over a decade under the protection of religious authority. The case would lead to significant changes in how religious communities were monitored and regulated, and it would serve as a stark reminder of how easily faith could be manipulated by those with evil intentions. As news of the discoveries spread, communities across America began to question religious leaders who demanded absolute submission and practiced unusual forms of spiritual discipline. The Blackwood case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of surrendering one's critical thinking to charismatic authority figures, regardless of their claimed divine inspiration. The victims of Thomas Blackwood's deception were ordinary people seeking comfort, community, and spiritual meaning in difficult times. They found instead a predator who used their deepest beliefs against them, transforming their faith into a weapon that ultimately destroyed them. Their story serves as a reminder that evil often wears the mask of righteousness, and that the most dangerous monsters are often those who claim to speak for God. This tale of the Church of the Prepared stands as one of the darkest chapters in American religious history, a reminder that the price of faith must never be the surrender of one's humanity or the questioning of one's conscience. The 113 victims buried beneath St. The investigation into the Church of the Prepared revealed horrors that would shake the foundations of American religious freedom. What authorities discovered beneath St. Catherine's Church defied comprehension, even for hardened federal investigators who had witnessed the worst of human depravity. When federal agents finally gained access to the sealed chambers beneath the church in late 1857, they found a meticulously organized system of murder that had operated for over a decade. The underground complex extended far beyond what anyone had imagined, comprising 17 separate chambers connected by narrow tunnels that stretched nearly 200 feet in every direction from the main church building. The first chamber, which investigators would later designate as the preparation room, contained evidence of the systematic drugging and restraint of victims. Leather restraints were bolted to stone tables, and shelves lined the walls containing bottles of laudanum, chloroform, and other substances used to render victims unconscious. Personal belongings of the missing were cataloged and stored in wooden crates, each labeled with dates and initials that corresponded to Blackwood's meticulous records. The second chamber revealed the true scope of Blackwood's deception. Here, investigators found the workshop where empty coffins had been constructed, complete with false bottoms and weighted materials designed to simulate the presence of human remains. Tools for coffin construction lay abandoned alongside partially completed caskets, some bearing the names of individuals who had supposedly died while serving as missionaries in distant lands. But it was the third chamber that provided the most damning evidence of Blackwood's crimes. Federal investigator Captain James Morrison, a veteran of the Mexican War who had witnessed battlefield atrocities, was physically ill upon entering what had been designated as the ritual chamber. The stone walls were stained with what appeared to be blood, and carved symbols covered every surface. Iron rings were embedded in the walls and floor, clearly designed to secure victims during whatever ceremonies had taken place within those walls. The chamber's most disturbing feature was a raised stone platform in the center, approximately 8 feet square, with channels carved into its surface that led to a drain in the floor. Surrounding the platform were wooden benches arranged in concentric circles, where Blackwood's inner circle had presumably observed the ritualistic murders he had disguised as divine transformations. Morrison's official report, sealed by federal authorities for nearly 60 years, described the scene in clinical detail. The platform shows evidence of repeated use for activities involving significant blood loss. Chemical analysis of stains confirms human origin. The positioning of restraint points and the carved channels suggest systematic and prolonged torture preceding death. The fourth chamber contained Blackwood's personal study, where investigators found detailed journals documenting each murder from the first killing in 1846 through the final victims in 1857. The journals revealed that Blackwood had not simply been eliminating troublesome followers, but had been conducting what he termed sacred experiments designed to test the limits of human endurance and the process of spiritual transformation. Each entry followed a similar format: the victim's name, age, and background, the method of selection and preparation, detailed descriptions of the torture inflicted, observations about the victim's responses, and finally, notes about the disposal of the body. The clinical precision of these records suggested a mind that had moved far beyond religious delusion into systematic sadism. One entry, dated March 15, 1854, provided a chilling example of Blackwood's methodology. Sister Martha, age 23, selected for her persistent questions regarding Brother Timothy's absence. Preparation period, 3 days of fasting and prayer. Subject maintained consciousness for 47 minutes during the first trial. Vocalization patterns consistent with previous subjects. Spiritual breakthrough achieved at 52 minutes, when subject began speaking in tongues. Transformation completed at 61 minutes. Body prepared according to standard protocol. The journals also revealed that Blackwood had been selling detailed accounts of his experiments to individuals he referred to as fellow seekers scattered across the country. These correspondences, found in a hidden compartment within his desk, indicated a network of like-minded individuals who were conducting similar activities under the guise of religious or scientific inquiry. The fifth chamber served as a preservation room where bodies were prepared for burial in the extensive catacombs that honeycomb the area beneath the church. Here, investigators found evidence of crude embalming techniques and body modification, suggesting that Blackwood had been experimenting with methods of preserving his victims for unknown purposes. The sixth chamber contained what appeared to be a library of occult and medical texts, including detailed anatomical drawings and treatises on torture techniques from various cultures and historical periods. Blackwood had apparently spent years researching and refining his methods, drawing inspiration from sources ranging from medieval Inquisition manuals to contemporary medical journals. The seventh chamber was perhaps the most disturbing of all. Here, investigators found evidence that Blackwood had been conducting experiments on living victims, keeping some alive for extended periods while subjecting them to various forms of torture and psychological manipulation. Cages built into the walls contained the remains of individuals who had apparently been imprisoned for weeks or months before their deaths. The remaining chambers served various support functions: storage for supplies, workshops for creating the tools used in Blackwood's experiments, and sleeping quarters for the handful of inner circle members who had been aware of and participated in the true activities of the Church of the Prepared. But even these discoveries paled in comparison to what investigators found in the catacombs themselves. The tunnels beneath the church contained the remains of 127 individuals, far more than the 113 initially reported. Many of the bodies showed signs of systematic torture, with evidence of wounds that had been inflicted over extended periods before death. Some skeletons displayed signs of surgical procedures, suggesting that Blackwood had been conducting anatomical experiments on his living victims. The arrangement of the bodies was equally disturbing. Rather than being buried in individual graves, the remains had been arranged in elaborate patterns throughout the tunnels, with some chambers containing dozens of skeletons positioned as if participating in some macabre ceremony. In several locations, the bones had been arranged to form symbols and geometric patterns, suggesting that Blackwood had viewed his victims as components in some larger ritual design. Chemical analysis of the soil and walls revealed that the catacombs had been in use for the entire 11-year period of Blackwood's operation, with the earliest burials dating to 1846. The systematic nature of the burials, combined with the preservation techniques employed, indicated that Blackwood had planned from the beginning to maintain his victims' remains for purposes that investigators could only speculate about. The discovery of Blackwood's operations sent shockwaves through American society. The revelation that such systematic evil could operate for over a decade under the guise of religious devotion challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of religious freedom and the limits of governmental oversight. The legal proceedings that followed were unprecedented in their scope and complexity. Blackwood was charged with 127 counts of murder, along with numerous additional charges, including fraud, conspiracy, and desecration of human remains. The trial, which began in Philadelphia in March 1858, lasted nearly 4 months and featured a testimony from over 200 witnesses. The prosecution's case was methodical and overwhelming. Survivor after survivor testified about the gradual escalation of Blackwood's demands, the mysterious disappearances of fellow believers, and the climate of fear that had pervaded the community. Expert witnesses provided detailed analysis of the physical evidence, confirming that the remains found beneath the church showed clear signs of torture and systematic murder. Blackwood's defense team, led by prominent Philadelphia attorney Samuel Morrison, initially attempted to argue that their client was the victim of religious persecution and that the deaths had been the result of disease and natural causes. However, the overwhelming physical evidence and the testimony of survivors made this defense untenable. As the trial progressed, Blackwood's attorneys shifted to a strategy of claiming that their client was mentally ill and therefore not responsible for his actions. They brought in physicians who testified about religious mania and the effects of isolation on mental stability. However, the prosecution countered with evidence of Blackwood's careful planning and the systematic nature of his crimes, which demonstrated clear premeditation and rational thought. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when Blackwood himself took the witness stand. Rather than showing remorse or attempting to minimize his crimes, he used the opportunity to deliver what amounted to a theological defense of his actions. Speaking calmly and rationally, he explained his belief that physical suffering was necessary for spiritual purification and that his victims had achieved a higher state of existence through their deaths. "I am not a murderer," Blackwood declared to the packed courtroom. "I am a servant of divine will, chosen to guide souls through the purification necessary for true salvation. Those who passed through my ministry achieved a spiritual elevation that few in this world can comprehend." The prosecution's response was swift and devastating. District Attorney William Hayes presented evidence of Blackwood's financial motivations, his systematic deception of his followers, and the clear premeditation involved in constructing the underground chambers and developing his methods of torture and murder. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. He sentenced Blackwood to death by hanging to be carried out on September 15th, 1858. However, Thomas Blackwood would never face the executioner. On the night of August 30th, 1858, just 16 days before his scheduled execution, Blackwood was found dead in his cell. The official cause of death was listed as suicide by hanging, using strips of cloth torn from his prison uniform. However, the circumstances surrounding his death raised questions that were never fully answered. The guard who discovered Blackwood's body reported that the cell door had been found unlocked, despite strict protocols requiring constant supervision of condemned prisoners. Additionally, a thorough search of the cell revealed a small vial containing traces of what appeared to be poison, though toxicology tests were inconclusive due to the limitations of 1858 forensic science. Most puzzling was the discovery of a letter in Blackwood's handwriting, apparently written shortly before his death, which contained detailed instructions for continuing his work and references to followers who would carry on his mission. The letter, which was immediately sealed by federal authorities, suggested that Blackwood's operation had been part of a larger network of similar activities. The investigation into Blackwood's possible accomplices and the broader network referenced in his final letter continued for several years, but yielded few concrete results. Several individuals who had been closely associated with the Church of the Prepared were arrested and questioned, but most were released due to lack of evidence of direct participation in the murders. The exception was Jeremiah Woodson, who had served as Blackwood's assistant and had been present during many of the ritual murders. Woodson, faced with overwhelming evidence of his participation, agreed to cooperate with authorities in exchange for a life sentence rather than execution. His testimony provided crucial details about the operation of the church and the methods used to maintain secrecy. According to Woodson's confession, Blackwood had been in communication with similar groups in at least 4 other states, sharing techniques and coordinating activities. These groups, operating under various religious guises, had been conducting similar experiments in human suffering and spiritual transformation. However, the disruption caused by the exposure of the Church of the Prepared had apparently caused these other groups to cease their activities or relocate to avoid detection. The physical site of St. Catherine's Church was completely destroyed by federal order in the summer of 1859. The building was demolished, the underground chambers were filled with concrete, and the entire area was sealed. The land was eventually sold to a private developer, though it remained vacant for nearly 20 years due to its association with the horrific crimes. The survivors of the Church of the Prepared faced a difficult process of reintegration into society. Many had lost family members, friends, and their entire worldview during their time with Blackwood. The federal government provided limited financial assistance, but the psychological trauma of their experiences proved more difficult to address. Sarah Morrison, whose investigation had ultimately led to the exposure of Blackwood's crimes, became an advocate for religious freedom reform and the protection of vulnerable individuals from exploitation by charismatic leaders. She testified before Congress about the need for greater oversight of religious organizations and the warning signs of dangerous cults. The Blackwood case had profound implications for American religious freedom. While the First Amendment's protection of religious expression remained intact, the case established important precedents for government intervention when religious practices involved criminal activity. The concept of religious freedom could not be used as a shield for murder, fraud, or other serious crimes. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of isolated religious communities to exploitation by charismatic but dangerous leaders. The gradual escalation of Blackwood's demands, the systematic isolation of his followers from outside influences, and the use of religious authority to justify increasingly extreme behaviors became recognized patterns that would be studied by sociologists and law enforcement for generations. In the years following the Blackwood case, several other religious groups were investigated and disbanded after exhibiting similar patterns of behavior. The case had made both authorities and the general public more aware of the potential for religious authority to be used as a cover for criminal activity. The empty coffins that had given the case its name became a powerful symbol of the deception and betrayal that characterized Blackwood's operation. Families who had mourned, loved ones they believed had died serving God in distant lands, discovered that their grief had been manipulated as part of an elaborate scheme to hide systematic murder. The psychological impact of this revelation was devastating. Not only had these families lost their loved ones to murder, but they had been deceived about the circumstances of their deaths and prevented from properly grieving. The empty coffins represented not just the absence of their loved ones' bodies, but the absence of truth, closure, and justice. The case of Thomas Blackwood and the Church of the Prepared remains one of the most disturbing examples of religious extremism in American history. The systematic nature of the crimes, the extended period over which they occurred, and the complete betrayal of trust involved in using religious authority to facilitate murder created a template for understanding how charismatic leaders can exploit faith for evil purposes. The 113 confirmed victims of Blackwood's operation, along with the additional 14 individuals whose remains were discovered in the catacombs, represent lives cut short by a man who perverted religious devotion into an instrument of torture and death. Their stories serve as a reminder of the importance of maintaining vigilance against those who would exploit our deepest spiritual needs for their own dark purposes. The legacy of the Church of the Prepared extends beyond the immediate horror of Blackwood's crimes. The case fundamentally changed how Americans viewed religious authority and the potential for spiritual manipulation. It demonstrated that evil could hide behind the most sacred facades, and that the protection of religious freedom required constant vigilance against those who would abuse that freedom. Today, the site where St. Catherine's Church once stood is marked only by a small memorial plaque installed by the state of Pennsylvania in 1958 to mark the centennial of Blackwood's death. The story of Thomas Blackwood and his 113 victims serves as a permanent reminder that the greatest evils often wear the mask of righteousness, and that our most sacred institutions require the most careful protection from those who would corrupt them. The empty coffins of the Church of the Prepared stand as symbols not just of death and deception, but of the eternal human struggle between faith and exploitation, between genuine spiritual seeking and the predators who would prey upon that seeking. In the end, The true horror of the Church of the Prepared lies not simply in the number of lives lost, but in the systematic betrayal of everything that religious communities should represent: love, protection, spiritual growth, and the sacred trust between shepherd and flock. The investigation that began with Prophet Caleb's public breakdown in 1881 had torn away the facade of respectability that had protected the Blackwood family for over a decade. But as federal agents continued their methodical examination of the church's hidden chambers and financial records, they discovered that the systematic murder of 113 followers was only the beginning of a much larger and more disturbing enterprise. The true scope of Thomas Blackwood's operation became clear when investigators found his personal study, a room that had been sealed behind a false wall in the church's basement. Unlike the crude torture chambers where his followers had met their deaths, this space revealed the calculating mind of a man who had transformed religious manipulation into a precise science. The walls were lined with detailed anatomical drawings, psychological profiles of his victims, and most chilling of all, correspondence with similar operations across the northeastern United States. Assistant Attorney General Morrison, who had traveled from Washington to oversee the investigation personally, described the study as a laboratory of human exploitation. Blackwood had documented every aspect of his followers' psychological breakdown, from their initial vulnerability to their final moments of terror. His journals revealed a man who viewed his victims not as human beings, but as subjects in an ongoing experiment in control and dominance. The financial records discovered in the study painted an even more disturbing picture. Blackwood had been selling detailed accounts of his methods to other religious leaders, creating what investigators would later describe as a franchise system of spiritual abuse. Letters from contacts in Vermont, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts indicated that at least 7 other communities had implemented variations of Blackwood's techniques, each paying substantial fees for his guidance and expertise. Dr. Samuel Hartwell, the physician who had examined many of the recovered bodies, provided crucial testimony about the systematic nature of the abuse. The victims showed evidence of prolonged psychological torture designed to break their will completely before their eventual murder. Some had been kept alive for weeks in the underground chambers, subjected to mock executions and false resurrections that convinced them Blackwood possessed divine powers over life and death. The method of murder itself revealed Blackwood's twisted understanding of both medicine and psychology. Rather than quick deaths, his victims were subjected to what he called purification rituals that gradually shut down their bodily functions while maintaining consciousness as long as possible. The empty coffins served not just to deceive families, but to create elaborate funeral ceremonies that reinforced his followers' belief in his supernatural abilities. Margaret Thurston, one of the few survivors who had escaped before the investigation began, provided the most detailed account of life inside Blackwood's compound. Her testimony revealed a community living in constant terror, where any sign of doubt or resistance resulted in selection for purification. Blackwood had created a hierarchy among his followers, with those closest to him granted small privileges in exchange for reporting on their fellow believers. The psychological manipulation extended to the children within the community. Blackwood had established what he called a school of divine preparation, where young people were systematically isolated from their parents and subjected to increasingly extreme indoctrination. 17 children were found in the compound's dormitories, all showing signs of severe psychological trauma and many unable to speak coherently about their experiences. The investigation uncovered evidence that Blackwood had been planning to expand his operation significantly. Architectural drawings found in his study showed plans for a much larger compound that could house over 500 followers, complete with expanded underground facilities and what appeared to be a crematorium designed to dispose of bodies more efficiently. Purchase agreements for land in 3 different states suggested he intended to create a network of similar communities across New England. The role of Blackwood's inner circle became clearer as investigators interviewed surviving members. His lieutenant, Samuel Morrison, had served as the primary executioner, carrying out the actual murders, while Blackwood conducted the religious ceremonies. Elizabeth Hartwell, the woman who had managed the compound's finances, had been responsible for the elaborate deceptions that kept families from discovering their loved ones' fates. Both had been found dead in their cells, apparently having taken poison rather than face prosecution. The community's isolation had been carefully planned and maintained. Blackwood had chosen the location specifically because it was far from major roads and surrounded by dense forest that made escape difficult. He had also established relationships with local authorities through generous donations and carefully cultivated friendships, ensuring that any concerns about his community would be dismissed or ignored. The investigation revealed that Blackwood's descent into murder had been gradual but systematic. Early followers described him as a charismatic but relatively conventional preacher who gradually introduced more extreme practices. The first deaths had been presented as miraculous translations, where particularly holy individuals were said to have been taken directly to heaven. Only later did these disappearances become more frequent and obviously connected to the underground chambers. The psychological profiles found in Blackwood's study showed his careful selection process for victims. He targeted individuals who were isolated, grieving, or otherwise vulnerable, then gradually increased their dependence on him and the community. The profiles included detailed notes about each person's fears, desires, and psychological weaknesses, information that was used to craft personalized manipulation strategies. The discovery of the compound's true nature sent shockwaves through the religious communities of Pennsylvania and surrounding states. Many legitimate religious leaders found themselves under scrutiny as authorities attempted to distinguish between unconventional but harmless practices and potentially dangerous groups. The case led to increased oversight of religious communities and new legal frameworks for investigating suspected abuse. The fate of the missing followers remained one of the investigation's most haunting aspects. While 113 bodies were recovered from the compound, church records indicated that nearly 200 people had joined Blackwood's community over the years. Some had left early and were located alive, but dozens remained unaccounted for. The discovery of partial remains in various locations suggested that some victims had been disposed of in ways that made identification impossible. The investigation also revealed the sophisticated nature of Blackwood's deception. He had created false identities for many of his followers, making it difficult for families to track their loved ones even when they became suspicious. The empty coffins were just one element of an elaborate system designed to create the appearance of natural deaths while hiding the reality of systematic murder. As the investigation concluded, federal authorities faced the challenge of preventing similar tragedies in the future. The case had revealed dangerous gaps in the oversight of religious communities and the ease with which charismatic leaders could exploit vulnerable individuals. New legislation was proposed to require regular inspections of religious communities and to establish clearer legal standards for investigating suspected abuse. The Blackwood case became a watershed moment in American religious history, demonstrating the dark potential of unchecked spiritual authority and the importance of maintaining vigilance against those who would exploit faith for evil purposes. The 113 victims of his purification rituals had paid the ultimate price for their trust in a man who had transformed divine promises into instruments of terror and death. The empty coffins that had once symbolized false hope for grieving families now served as a stark reminder of the depths of human deception and the need for constant vigilance in protecting the vulnerable from those who would abuse their trust. The investigation reached its climax in the spring of 1857, when a series of disturbing discoveries would finally expose the full scope of Elder Blackwood's operations. What began as routine inquiries by concerned family members would ultimately reveal a network of deception, corruption, and systematic murder that stretched far beyond the quiet hills of Millbrook, Pennsylvania. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Margaret O'Sullivan, a seamstress from the nearby town of Clearwater, had been growing increasingly concerned about her sister Catherine, who had joined the Church of the Prepared 2 years earlier. Catherine's letters, initially filled with descriptions of spiritual fulfillment and divine purpose, had gradually become shorter, more cryptic, and disturbing in their content. The final letter Margaret received in February 1857 contained a single line that would haunt her for the rest of her life. "The translation is near, dear sister." Margaret's attempts to visit Catherine were repeatedly rebuffed by church members who claimed she was in deep spiritual preparation and could not receive visitors. When Margaret persisted, Elder Blackwood himself met with her, his commanding presence and scriptural eloquence initially allaying her fears. But something in his pale eyes, she later testified, convinced her that her sister was in mortal danger. Unable to secure help from local authorities, who viewed the Church of the Prepared as a respected religious institution, Margaret traveled to Philadelphia, where she contacted the Pennsylvania Society for the Investigation of Religious Irregularities, a small but determined organization founded by former members of various questionable religious movements. The Society's president, Dr. William Thornton, was a Methodist minister who had made it his mission to expose religious charlatans and protect vulnerable souls from spiritual predators. Dr. Thornton's investigation began with a careful examination of the Church of the Prepared's public records and published materials. What he discovered immediately raised red flags. The church's membership rolls showed a pattern of rapid turnover, with dozens of members reportedly transferring to other locations or dying of various illnesses at rates far exceeding normal mortality statistics. More troubling were the financial records, which showed massive expenditures for construction projects that seemed disproportionate to the church's modest size and visible improvements. Working with a network of contacts throughout Pennsylvania, Dr. Thornton began quietly gathering testimony from former church members who had managed to escape Blackwood's influence. The stories they told painted a picture of systematic psychological manipulation, escalating demands for absolute obedience, and a growing obsession with death and purification that culminated in the translation ceremonies. The most damning testimony came from Rebecca Walsh, a young woman who had fled the church in the dead of night after witnessing what she believed to be the murder of her friend during a translation ritual. Walsh had initially been too terrified to speak, convinced that Blackwood's network of informants would track her down and silence her permanently. But Dr. Thornton's patient encouragement and promise of protection finally convinced her to reveal what she had seen. According to Walsh's testimony, the translation ceremonies had evolved far beyond the public rituals that outside observers occasionally witnessed. The victims, weakened by drugs and psychological manipulation, were told that their suffering was necessary for their spiritual purification and that their deaths would serve a divine purpose. Walsh described witnessing the translation of her friend Martha, a gentlewoman in her 20s who had joined the church seeking comfort after the death of her husband. The ceremony, conducted before an audience of inner circle members, involved hours of ritualistic torture that Walsh could barely bring herself to describe. Throughout the ordeal, Blackwood and his assistants maintained that Martha's screams were expressions of divine ecstasy and that her eventual death was a triumphant ascension to a higher plane of existence. Most horrifying of all was Walsh's account of what happened to the bodies after the translation ceremonies. The bodies were partially mummified, using techniques that Blackwood claimed had been revealed to him in visions, then arranged in elaborate tableaux that served as inspiration for future ceremonies. The underground chambers, Walsh testified, contained dozens of these preserved corpses, creating a macabre gallery of Blackwood's victims. Armed with this testimony and supporting evidence from other sources, Dr. Thornton petitioned the Pennsylvania Attorney General for an official investigation. The request was initially met with skepticism, as religious freedom was strongly protected and accusations against established churches required extraordinary evidence. However, the mounting documentation and the credibility of the witnesses eventually convinced authorities to take action. The investigation was assigned to Deputy Attorney General Samuel Harrison, a methodical prosecutor who had built his reputation on careful preparation and attention to detail. Harrison understood that any case against the Church of the Prepared would require irrefutable evidence, as Blackwood's reputation and connections would make him a formidable opponent in court. Harrison's first step was to establish surveillance of the church compound, using federal marshals disguised as travelers and laborers to observe the daily activities of the congregation. What they reported confirmed many of the allegations made by former members. The church operated with military-like discipline, with members required to account for their time and activities to designated supervisors. New members were quickly isolated from outside contacts and subjected to intensive indoctrination sessions that sometimes lasted for days. More troubling were the nighttime activities observed by the surveillance team. On several occasions, Marshals reported seeing groups of church members carrying what appeared to be bodies wrapped in white cloth from the main church building to unmarked graves in the woods behind the compound. When these burial sites were later examined, investigators found that the graves had been deliberately obscured and contained no proper grave markers or religious symbols. The breakthrough in the investigation came when Harrison's team intercepted correspondence between Blackwood and associates in other states. The letters, written in a crude cipher that was eventually decoded by Army cryptographers, revealed the existence of a network of similar operations throughout the eastern United States. Blackwood was not operating in isolation, but was part of a coordinated enterprise that trafficked in both living victims and preserved corpses. One particularly damning letter, addressed to a contact in Baltimore, detailed the special preparations required for shipping preserved specimens to medical schools and private collectors. The letter mentioned prices ranging from $50 to $200 per body, depending on the quality of preservation and the specific requirements of the purchaser. The correspondence made clear that the Church of the Prepared was not merely a religious cult, but a commercial enterprise that used spiritual manipulation to acquire victims for a lucrative trade in human remains. The evidence was overwhelming, but Harrison knew that successfully prosecuting Blackwood would require catching him in the act of his crimes. Working with Dr. Thornton and Rebecca Walsh, the investigators devised a plan to infiltrate the church and document the translation ceremonies firsthand. Walsh, despite her terror of returning to the compound, agreed to pose as a penitent seeking readmission to the church, while undercover marshals would position themselves to observe and record whatever occurred. The plan was set in motion on the night of April 15, 1857, when Walsh appeared at the church gates claiming to have experienced a spiritual revelation that convinced her to return to the fold. Blackwood, suspicious but intrigued by the possibility of reclaiming a lost sheep, agreed to meet with her privately. Unknown to him, the meeting was observed by marshals positioned in the woods around the compound, and Walsh carried a small notebook in which she recorded everything that transpired. Blackwood's questioning of Walsh revealed the depth of his paranoia and the extent of his intelligence network. He knew details about her life since leaving the church that suggested he had been monitoring her activities through informants in various communities. More disturbing were his references to other former members who had attempted to expose the church's activities, mentioning that they had been guided back to the path of righteousness through methods that Walsh understood to be threats or actual violence. During their conversation, Blackwood made statements that would later prove crucial to the prosecution's case. He spoke openly about the translation ceremonies, describing them as necessary sacrifices that served both spiritual and practical purposes. The souls of the translated, he claimed, were purified through suffering and ascended to serve as intermediaries between the earthly church and divine realm. Their bodies, meanwhile, were preserved as sacred relics that could provide instruction and inspiration to medical students and researchers seeking to understand the divine architecture of human form. Most damning of all was Blackwood's casual mention of the network of associates who shared his vision and supported his work. He spoke of physicians in Philadelphia and New York who provided medical knowledge in exchange for specially prepared specimens, of wealthy collectors who paid premium prices for bodies that had been sanctified through the translation process, and of other religious leaders who had established similar operations in distant locations. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of several inner circle members who informed Blackwood that a new candidate had been selected for translation. Walsh watched in horror as they discussed the upcoming ceremony, debating the specific tortures that would be employed and the preservation techniques that would be used afterward. The casual, businesslike tone of the discussion made clear that what they were planning was routine rather than exceptional. As the meeting concluded, Blackwood informed Walsh that her readmission to the church would require a period of purification and testing. She would be confined to a special chamber where she could meditate on her sins and prepare for possible translation herself. The threat was thinly veiled, and Walsh understood that her life now hung in the balance. The marshals observing the compound had seen enough to confirm the most serious allegations against the Church of the Prepared. They had witnessed the selection of a victim, overheard discussions of torture and murder, and observed the systematic way in which the church operated its criminal enterprise. But they also knew that Walsh was now in mortal danger, and that any delay in taking action could cost her life. The decision was made to move immediately. On the night of April 16, 1857, federal marshals surrounded the Church of the Prepared compound, while Deputy Attorney General Harrison served arrest warrants on Elder Blackwood and his principal associates. The raids were timed to coincide with the beginning of the translation ceremony, ensuring that the authorities would have direct evidence of the church's criminal activities. What they found exceeded even their worst expectations. The underground chambers contained not only the preserved remains of dozens of victims, but also detailed records of the church's operations dating back to its founding. Blackwood had kept meticulous documentation of every translation ceremony, including the names of victims, the methods used to kill them, and the disposition of their bodies. The records showed that over the 11-year period of the church's existence, 113 people had been murdered in the name of spiritual purification. The discovery of the empty coffins provided the final piece of the puzzle. The church had been conducting elaborate funeral services for members who had supposedly died of natural causes, complete with coffins that were buried in the church cemetery. But the coffins were empty, containing only stones and sand to simulate the weight of bodies. The actual corpses were either preserved in the underground chambers or sold to medical schools and private collectors, while the grieving families were left to mourn over empty graves. The scope of the deception was staggering. Blackwood had created an entire infrastructure of lies, manipulating not only his followers, but also the broader community that had trusted him as a man of God. The investigation revealed that he had forged death certificates, bribed officials, and even arranged for accomplices to pose as relatives of victims to prevent awkward questions about missing persons. As news of the discoveries spread, the full extent of Blackwood's network began to emerge. Arrests were made in Philadelphia, New York, Baltimore, and other cities, where associates had been operating similar schemes. The investigation revealed that the Church of the Prepared was part of a larger criminal enterprise that had systematically exploited religious faith for profit, using spiritual manipulation to acquire victims for a trade in human remains that generated enormous profits for its operators. The evidence against Blackwood was overwhelming, but the man himself would never face trial. On the morning of April 20th, 1857, he was found dead in his cell in the county jail, apparently having taken poison that had been smuggled to him by an unknown accomplice. His death ensured that many of the secrets of the Church of the Prepared would die with him, including the full extent of his network and the identities of all his associates. The investigation into the Church of the Prepared continued for months after Blackwood's death, with authorities working to identify all the victims and trace the full scope of the criminal enterprise. The final tally was sobering: 113 confirmed murders, dozens of additional disappearances that could not be definitively linked to the church, and a network of corruption that extended throughout the eastern United States. The case sent shockwaves through American society, challenging fundamental assumptions about religious authority and the protection of individual rights. It led to new laws governing religious institutions, improved oversight of medical schools and anatomical research, and a greater awareness of the dangers posed by charismatic leaders who exploit faith for personal gain. The site of the Church of the Prepared was eventually razed, and the land was consecrated as a memorial to the victims. The empty coffins were exhumed and replaced with proper graves containing the remains of those who could be identified and recovered. A simple monument was erected bearing the names of the 113 confirmed victims, with the inscription, "In memory of those who trusted in faith and were betrayed by evil." The story of the Church of the Prepared serves as a chilling reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind even the most respectable facades. It demonstrates how easily trust can be exploited, how gradually evil can normalize itself, and how important it is to remain vigilant against those who would use positions of authority to prey upon the vulnerable. The 113 victims of Elder Blackwood's twisted vision were not just statistics, but individuals who had sought spiritual comfort and instead found only suffering and death. Their memory endures as a warning about the dangers of blind faith and unquestioning obedience to authority. The final chapter of the Blackstone Insurance Company's saga reveals perhaps the most disturbing truth of all, that evil of this magnitude never truly dies. It simply adapts and evolves. What began as a twisted scheme to exploit America's working families became a template for institutional corruption that would echo through generations, hidden beneath layers of respectability and protected by a web of complicity that stretched from small-town sheriffs to the highest levels of government. The 113 victims buried in those empty coffins represent more than just individual tragedies. They symbolize the countless Americans who trusted their institutions and paid the ultimate price for that faith. Their story serves as a stark reminder that the greatest monsters often wear the most respectable faces, and that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance against those who would exploit our trust for their own murderous gain. Perhaps most chilling of all is the realization that somewhere in America's vast archives, sealed documents still await discovery, containing secrets that powerful interests spent fortunes to bury. The Blackstone legacy lives on not just in the unmarked graves scattered across Pennsylvania's countryside, but in the uncomfortable truth that systematic evil can flourish when good people choose silence over justice and institutional loyalty over moral courage. Remember their names, remember their suffering, and remember that the darkness they faced still lurks in the shadows of our modern world, waiting for the next opportunity to exploit our faith in those we trust to protect us. The most haunting aspect of the Blackstone case isn't what we know, but what remains hidden in the shadows of American history. In 1962, exactly 111 years after the original investigation, construction workers renovating the basement of the Pennsylvania State Archives made a discovery that would send shockwaves through the highest levels of government. Behind a false wall, sealed with bricks and mortar, they found a collection of documents that suggested the Blackstone conspiracy had tentacles reaching far beyond what anyone had imagined. The cache included correspondence between Morai Blackstone and individuals whose names would become synonymous with American industrial power, railroad barons, steel magnates, and banking dynasties whose fortunes helped build the nation. According to these documents, the Blackstone operation had been designed not just to generate profits through murder and fraud, but to create a comprehensive intelligence network that could manipulate markets, influence elections, and control the flow of information across the rapidly expanding United States. The systematic killing of policyholders served multiple purposes. It eliminated potential witnesses, generated immediate cash flow, and, most disturbingly, created a climate of fear that made survivors more compliant and easier to control. One particularly chilling document, dated 1847, outlined what Morai called the 100-Year Plan, a detailed strategy for establishing similar operations in every major American city by 1950. The plan included provisions for infiltrating law enforcement agencies, corrupting judicial systems, and establishing legitimate businesses as cover for illegal activities. Most shocking of all was the revelation that several major American corporations, including two that would later become Fortune 500 companies, had been founded with blood money from the Blackstone Empire. The discovery of these documents in 1962 coincided with the height of the Cold War, when American intelligence agencies were already grappling with concerns about Soviet infiltration and domestic subversion. The idea that a homegrown criminal conspiracy might have been operating within American institutions for over a century was too dangerous to acknowledge publicly. Within 48 hours of the discovery, federal agents had confiscated every document, sworn all witnesses to secrecy under the National Security Act, and officially classified the entire matter as a threat to national security. But the truth has a way of surfacing, even when buried beneath layers of official denial. In 1987, a former CIA analyst named Robert Kellerman published a book titled The Hidden History of American Enterprise that contained barely veiled references to the Blackstone Network. The book was quickly pulled from circulation after legal challenges from multiple corporations, but not before investigative journalists had begun following the breadcrumbs. What they found was a pattern of suspicious deaths, unexplained wealth transfers, and institutional cover-ups that stretched from the original Blackstone case through to the present day. Insurance companies that should have been bankrupted by massive claim payouts somehow remained solvent. Police departments that should have been disbanded for corruption were quietly reformed under new leadership. Politicians who should have been prosecuted for complicity were instead promoted to higher office. The most disturbing revelation came from an unlikely source, the private journals of Thomas Henley, the insurance investigator who had originally exposed the Blackstone conspiracy. These journals, discovered in 1995 during the renovation of his great-grandson's attic, revealed that Henley had continued investigating the network long after the official case was closed. His final entry, dated December 1891, contained a warning that would prove prophetic. The Hydra has been wounded but not killed, so cut off one head and two more appear in its place. Today, more than 170 years after the first Blackstone murder, questions remain that may never be fully answered. How many victims were there really? How many institutions were compromised? And most chilling of all, how much of the network survived to influence the America we know today? The empty coffins of those 113 victims stand as a monument not just to their suffering, but to the terrible truth that some secrets are too dangerous for the powerful to let die. Their story reminds us that in a nation built on trust and institutions, the greatest threat may come not from foreign enemies or natural disasters, but from those who would corrupt the very foundations